The air in the backstage area of the House of Bellini was thick, with the scent of hairspray, expensive perfume, and panic. It was 20 minutes to showtime, the most critical night of the Milan Fashion Week. Elena Rossi stood by a rack of shimmering silk gowns, a pincushion wrapped around her wrist like a boxer's tape. She held a delicate bead between her thumb and forefinger, her stitches invisible to the naked eye. She was invisible. That was the rule. The seamstress is the ghost in the machine, the breath in the lungs of the model, but never the face. You call this a hemline? The voice sliced through the noise. Marco Bellini, the creative director. The king. Elena looked up. Marco was standing over Isabella Moretti, the lead designer. Isabella was pale, her makeup slightly too sharp for her panicked expression. On the dress form in front of them, the centerpiece of the Collectiona gravity-defying silk gown was slumped. The structural corset inside had buckled. "It's the fabric, Marco," Isabella stammered, shooting a venomous glance at Elena. "The tension is wrong. The seamstress must have used the wrong thread count." Elena stepped forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. "Mr. Bellini, the issue isn't the thread. The silk weight is too heavy for the internal boning Isabella chose. I drafted a reinforced structure yesterday." Marco turned to her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her apron, the stains of labor, the badge of servitude. "Did I ask for the janitor's opinion?" Marco asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse. It was bored. The assistants nearby snickered. A low hum of cruelty. "I'm not a janitor, sir. I'm the senior seamstress," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "If we don't reinforce the bodice, it will collapse on the runway. I have a backup design in my locker. It uses a fusion technique." Isabella laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound. "A backup design? You think you're a designer, Elena? You thread needles. You sweep floors. You are hands, not a brain." Marco waved his hand, a gesture of dismissal, so casual it felt like a slap. "Get her out of my sight. We don't have time for delusions of grandeur. Fix the dress, Isabella, or find someone who can." 2 security guards moved in. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a wall. Elena looked at the Dress the Dying Swan on the mannequin. She looked at Isabella, who was already barking orders up in the fabric tighter, ignoring the laws of physics. Elena nodded. She unclipped her pincushion. She placed it on the table. She walked out of the backstage area, past the models smoking cigarettes, past the influencers adjusting their rings, and into the cold Milan night. She didn't leave the building. She couldn't, because Elena Rossi knew something Marco Bellini didn't. She knew that the dress wasn't just flawed. It was a ticking time bomb, and she had the only fuse cutter in the entire city sitting in her bag. If you ever felt the sting of being underestimated, of your voice being drowned out by people with louder titles but smaller minds, stay with me. This isn't just a story about a dress. It's a story about the moment silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. Elena sat on a crate in the alleyway behind the venue. The muffled bass of the pre-show music thumped through the brick wall. She opened her worn leather satchel. Inside, wrapped in muslin, was a sketchbook. And inside that sketchbook was a design that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. She called it the Resurrection. It wasn't just a dress. It was architecture. It was a bodice made of memory wire and silk organza, woven in a way that didn't just hug the body, it seemed to float around it. It was a solution to the silk weight problem. It was beautiful, and it was currently being ignored. She pulled out her phone. No messages. Of course not. Why would the king message a peasant? She looked at the timestamp on her digital sketch files. October 12th, 3 months ago. She had emailed the concept to Isabella as a suggestion. Isabella had never replied, but Elena had seen the elements creeping into the current collection poorly executed, half remembered, stripped of the engineering that made them work. Isabella hadn't just ignored her. She had stolen the shadow of the idea without understanding the light behind it. Elena lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. She watched the smoke curl up towards a Milan sky. "You're still here." Elena jumped. It was Sophia, the head tailor, a woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen 1,000 fashion wars. Sophia stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. "I was kicked out Elena said, her voice raspy. They said I was delusional. Sophia stepped closer, lowering her voice. Isabella is panicking. The second model tried on the main gown. The strap snapped. It's falling apart. Elena, they are pinning it together with hopes and prayers. Elena stubbed out her cigarette. They have my sketches. They have the prototype fabric I left on Isabella's desk. They aren't using them, Sophia said grimly. Isabella told Marco that she improvised a fix. She's too proud to admit she needs your help. She's sending the girls out in dresses that are held together by double-sided tape and ego. Sophia looked at Elena's bag. You have the real construction, don't you? Elena nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded bundle of fabric, the prototype bodice. It was heavy, dense, but fluid, a miracle of textile engineering. Go back in there, Sophia urged. Give it to Marco. Show him. Marco humiliated me. Sophia. He called me to help. Elena's jaw tightened. If I go back now and begging, I'm admitting he has power over me. If you don't, Sophia said softly, the house fails. The investors pull out. We all lose our jobs. Even the ghosts need a house to haunt. Elena stood up. She looked at the service door. The pulse of the music was getting faster. The show was starting. I'm not giving it to Marco. Elena said, her eyes clearing. I'm giving it to the show. There's a difference. She walked back in. The atmosphere backstage was no longer chaotic. It was a code red. The first segment of the show, the Ready Tower section, had gone fine, but the haute couture finale was approaching. Elena slipped through the shadows. She saw Isabella screaming at a terrified intern. Marco was standing by the runway entrance, his face a mass of stone, arms crossed. He looked calm, but Elena saw the way he tapped his foot, unnervous till he thought he had trained out of himself years ago. She made her way to the model lineup. The lead model for the finale was Valentina. She was tall, fierce, and currently looking at the disaster of a dress she was supposed to wear with sheer horror. It weighs 50 pounds, Valentina hissed to the dresser. It's dragging me down. I can't walk in this. Elena stepped into the light. Valentina. Valentina turned, relief washing over her face. Elena, thank God. This thing is a torture device. I know, Elena said. She glanced at Isabella, who was busy adjusting a cuff on a male model across the room, deliberately ignoring the disaster she had created. Elena reached into her bag. She pulled out the prototype bodice she had been carrying. It shimmered like oil on water. Put this on under the silk overlay, Elena whispered. It redistributes the weight. It will hold the structure. Isabella doesn't need to know. Just wear it. Valentina grabbed the piece. You're saving the show. Elena, not Isabella. Just walk, Valentina. Give them a show. Sometimes the greatest act of defiance isn't shouting. It's doing the job you were never given credit for, simply because the work deserves it. Elena was about to save the people who destroyed her. And that is the hardest kind of strength. The music shifted. A deep, resonant cello began to play. The finale. Marco clapped his hands. Places. Valentina stepped into the heels. She slipped the dress on. It was the avant-garde piece layers of heavy silk meant to look like ocean waves. But instead of slumping, the fabric cascaded perfectly. It caught the air. It moved like water. Marco froze. He stared at Valentina. He had expected a disaster. He had prepared his excuses. But the dress. It worked. What? He looked at Isabella. I thought the structure collapsed. Isabella, sweating, smiled tightly. I reinforced it. Just now. A trade secret. Marco narrowed his eyes. He looked at the dress. It didn't look like Isabella's work. Isabella's work was stiff. This was fluid. This was intelligent. Go, Marco whispered. Valentina walked. She didn't just walk, she flew. The dress floated around her, defying gravity. From the wings, Elena watched. She stood behind a rack of clothes, holding her breath. She saw the flash of cameras. She heard the gasp from the audience. It wasn't a polite gasp. It was a what is happening gasp. But then disaster struck. As Valentina reached the end of the runway, A seam on the overlay stitched hastily by Isabella's team ripped. The heavy silk began to slide off the shoulder. The audience murmured. Hands flew to mouths. Isabella gasped from the side. No, no, no. Valentina froze. She looked terrified. Elena didn't think. She moved. She didn't run onto the runway. Instead, she grabbed a bolt of black velvet from the prop table. She signaled to Luca, the male model walking behind Valentina. Pin it, she mouthed, throwing him the velvet and a handful of pins. Luca, a professional, understood instantly. He walked up behind Valentina, wrapping the velvet around the torn seam, creating a dramatic, high-contrast sash right there on the runway. He posed behind her, looking like a protective shadow. It wasn't a repair. It was an improvisation. It was art. The crowd erupted. They didn't know it was a mistake. They thought it was the climax of the show. The unveiling. The interaction between the dark velvet and the silk. Marco watched, his mouth slightly open. He turned to the side, looking for Isabella. He found Elena instead. She was standing in the wings, her chest heaving, pin still clutched in her hand. She met his gaze. She didn't look down. She didn't look away. She looked at him with the quiet fury of 1,000 stitches. The show ended. The applause was deafening. The lights went down. Backstage, chaos returned. Champagne corks popped. Investors clapped Marco on the back. But Marco was looking for someone else. He pushed past Isabella, who was trying to accept praise for the structure. He found Elena in the workroom. She was packing her bag. She was leaving. Stop, Marco said. Elena froze. She didn't turn around. I have my check coming, Mr. Bellini. He'll pick it up next week. The bodice, Marco said. His voice was low. It wasn't Isabella's. Elena stayed silent. I know Isabella's stitching. He continued, walking closer. It's aggressive. It fights the fabric. That bodice. It respected the weave. It breathed. Elena turned slowly. It was a prototype. I made it months ago. Marco looked at the table where her sketches lay. He picked up the open book. He saw the drawings, the dates, the notes. He saw the watermark of genius that had been sitting under his nose for 5 years. You showed this to Isabella, Marco said. It wasn't a question. She ignored it, Elena said. Then she used the concept without the foundation. That's why it ripped. Marco closed the book. He looked at the woman he had called a janitor less than 2 hours ago. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the fire he had been searching for in every model, every fabric, every designer he hired. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. I tried, Elena said, her voice steel. You told me I was just hands. Marco flinched. It was a physical blow. He looked at the floor. The arrogance drained out of him, leaving only the aging man underneath. Isabella takes credit for the line. Marco said quietly, that is the public story. Elena laughed softly. It was a sad sound. Of course she does. But the next collection, Marco said, looking up, the spring collection. I need a new lead. Elena looked at him. You have a lead. Isabella. Isabella just destroyed a dress on international television. Marco said sharply. She panicked. You improvise a masterpiece in 3 seconds with a bolt of velvet. He held out the sketchbook. You're fired, Marco said. Elena blinked. The air left the room. What? You're fired as a seamstress, Marco said. A small, rare smile touched his lips. I don't let creative directors sew their own hems. Elena stared at him. You can't be serious. Start Monday, Marco said. He placed the sketchbook back in her hands. And Elena, bring the velvet. Subscribe for the next chapter. Because the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's making them realize they can't survive without you. He walked away. He didn't apologize. He didn't grovel. He offered her what she had earned. Elena stood in the empty room. The distant sound of the after-party buzzed through the walls. She looked down at her hands. The hands he had dismissed. They were stained with ink and pricked with needles. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled all night. She walked out of the workroom, not toward the exit, but towards the runway. The lights were still on. The empty catwalk stretched out before her like a promise. She stepped onto the white platform. She stood where Valentina had stood. She looked out at the empty seats, the discarded programs at Red House of Bellini. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence. It sounded like a beginning. Elena Rossi was no longer invisible. The needle had finally found its thread, and the world was about to see the tapestry she had been hiding all along.